The rain began as a whisper against the asphalt of Newark's industrial district, where the night carried secrets heavier than the storm clouds gathering overhead. It was the kind of evening when honest people stayed indoors, when the streets belonged to those who operated in shadows, and when deals were made that would never see the light of courtrooms or morning newspapers. Don Alessandro Costa stepped out of his black Mercedes, the vehicle's door closing with the definitive sound of expensive German engineering. At 47 years old, Alessandro had built an empire that stretched from the dockyards of New Jersey to the construction contracts of Manhattan. His name was spoken in hushed tones in boardrooms and back alleys alike. Developers called him for impossible permits. Unions consulted him before strikes. Police detectives knew better than to dig too deep into certain cases. He was not merely a criminal. He was an institution, a parallel government that functioned with ruthless efficiency in the spaces where legitimate authority feared to tread. The warehouse loomed before him, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust and decades of industrial grime. Inside, 3 men waited, representatives of a Colombian network looking to expand their distribution channels through Alessandro's territory. The negotiation would be delicate. These men had money and product, but they lacked infrastructure and political protection. Alessandro had both. The terms needed to be precise, the power dynamic established without ambiguity. One wrong word, one perceived weakness, and the meeting could end in bloodshed. 6 of Alessandro's men flanked him, their hands resting casually near concealed weapons. These were professionals, former military, ex-law enforcement, men who had crossed lines they could never uncross, and now existed in Alessandro's orbit because there was nowhere else for them to go. They moved with practiced coordination, scanning windows, doorways, roof lines. The rain intensified, drumming against metal and concrete, creating a white noise that would mask conversations and, if necessary, gunfire. Alessandro adjusted his charcoal suit jacket, feeling the familiar weight of the pistol holstered at the small of his back. He had carried a weapon for so long that its absence would have felt like missing a limb. His dark hair, graying elegantly at the temples, was slicked back in a style that spoke of old-world traditions maintained in a modern wasteland. His face bore the hardened expression of a man who had made terrible decisions and lived with their consequences without flinching. The warehouse door stood 50 feet away. 20 more steps, and they would be inside, committed to whatever the next 2 hours would bring. Alessandro's mind ran through contingencies, backup plans, exit strategies. This was how he had survived when others had fallen, by thinking 3 moves ahead, by never allowing emotion to cloud judgment, by understanding that in his world, sentimentality was a fatal weakness. Then came the voice, "Sir, can you help me find my daddy?" The words cut through the rain and the tension like a blade through silk. Every one of Alessandro's men froze, hands moving reflexively toward weapons, heads turning to identify the source of this impossible interruption. For a moment, time seemed to suspend itself in the downpour. Standing beneath a flickering street lamp whose yellow light struggled against the storm's darkness was a little girl. She could not have been more than 6 years old, small for her age, with tangled dark hair plastered against her pale face by the rain. She wore a pink winter coat that had seen better seasons, its synthetic material soaked through and clinging to her thin frame. In her hands, she clutched the bent remains of a child's umbrella, red with white polka dots, one of its ribs broken so that the fabric hung at an awkward angle, offering no protection from the elements. But it was her eyes that struck Alessandro like a physical blow. They were large and dark, framed by rain-soaked lashes, and they held something he had not encountered in years: pure, uncalculated hope. She looked at him not with the fear that his appearance typically inspired, not with the calculation of those seeking favors or the hatred of those who had suffered under his decisions. She looked at him as a child looks at an adult who might help, with the innocent faith that the world contained people who would do the right thing simply because it was right. Alessandro turned fully toward her, his mind racing through possibilities. This could be a setup, a distraction engineered by rivals or law enforcement. Children had been used as bait before, their innocence weaponized by those cynical enough to exploit it. His men thought the same. He could see it in their tensed postures, their scanning of surrounding buildings for snipers or surveillance teams. But something in the scene felt wrong for an ambush. The girl's clothes were genuinely shabby, not costume department shabby. The desperation in her face was real, the kind that came from actual fear and confusion rather than coached performance. And she was alone. No handlers lurking in nearby doorways, no surveillance vehicles idling at the corner. Just one small child, soaked to the bone, standing in a place no child should be at an hour when no child should be awake. Alessandro raised a hand, a subtle gesture that his men understood immediately. "Stand down. Wait. Watch, but do not act." He took 3 steps toward the girl, his expensive leather shoes splashing through puddles that reflected the strobing yellow of the street lamp. As he approached, he could see she was shivering, whether from cold or fear or both. He could not determine. He stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to speak without shouting over the rain, far enough to avoid frightening her further. When he spoke, his voice, so often used to issue commands and threats, softened in a way that surprised even himself. The girl's name was Anna. She told him this while clutching her broken umbrella like a talisman, her words tumbling out in the breathless way of children who have been holding something inside for too long. Her mother was sick, very sick, in the hospital. They had come to Newark 2 years ago after her father disappeared. Her mother had told her that her father used to work for men who drove cars like the ones Anna saw tonight. Expensive, black, powerful cars that looked like they belonged to important people. As Anna spoke, Alessandro felt something crack inside the carefully constructed walls he had built around whatever remained of his conscience. He knew exactly what Anna's situation meant. Her father had not simply disappeared. Men did not just vanish in this world. They were disappeared, deliberately and permanently, by people like Alessandro himself. The fact that the father had worked for organized crime meant he had likely crossed some line, stolen, informed, showed disloyalty, and had paid the ultimate price. One of Alessandro's guards, a man named Sal, who had been with him for 15 years, had gone pale. Sal was the family man of the crew, the one who still went to his daughter's school plays and coached Little League on weekends, maintaining the fiction of normalcy in a profoundly abnormal life. Alessandro caught his eye and saw the conflict there, the recognition that this child represented collateral damage from their world, the innocent casualties who were never supposed to be visible. The meeting in the warehouse no longer mattered. The Colombians could wait, or they could leave. Alessandro would deal with the consequences later. Right now, standing in the rain facing a 6-year-old girl, seeking a father who was almost certainly dead by someone's order, possibly even his own, Alessandro Costa made a decision that defied every principle of self-preservation he had lived by for 3 decades. He dismissed his men with a gesture, ignoring their shocked expressions. He told them to reschedule the meeting, to handle the Colombians diplomatically, to return the cars to the compound. Then he knelt in the rain-soaked street, bringing himself to eye level with Anna, and asked her to take him to her mother. St. Michael's Medical Center rose against the Newark skyline like a monument to human fragility, its windows glowing with harsh fluorescent light that seemed to promise salvation and deliver only temporary reprieve. Alessandro had been inside hospitals before, visiting wounded associates, attending to his own injuries from conflicts that never made police reports, standing at deathbeds of men whose final moments required his presence as both boss and witness. But he had never entered one like this, with a small child's hand tentatively grasping two of his fingers, guiding him through sliding glass doors into a world that operated on different rules than his own. The emergency room waiting area assaulted them with competing stimuli, the chemical smell of industrial disinfectant fighting against the organic reality of illness and injury, the overhead television playing muted late-night programming, the fluorescent lights that drained color and humanity from every face. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency behind a central station, their scrubs decorated with cheerful patterns that felt grotesquely at odds with the suffering contained within these walls. Anna led Alessandro past the waiting area, through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, each turn revealing more of the hospital's intimate geography. The vending machines with their dim glow, the gurneys lined against walls, the patients in various states of distress visible through partially open doors. She moved with the familiarity of someone who had made this journey many times, who had become accustomed to navigating institutional spaces that should be foreign to childhood. They reached the third floor where the long-term care patients resided, those too ill to go home but not critical enough for intensive care, existing in medical limbo while insurance companies calculated costs and doctors managed declining trajectories. Anna stopped at room 317 and looked up at Alessandro with an expression that mingled hope and fear. She was afraid, he realized, of what they might find inside. The woman in the bed was perhaps 35, but looked a decade older, her face bearing the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting a losing battle against disease and poverty simultaneously. An IV line ran from her left arm to a bag of clear fluid hanging from a metal stand. The monitors beside her bed displayed numbers that Alessandro, despite his lack of medical knowledge, recognized as concerning. Blood pressure too low, oxygen saturation inadequate. Her dark hair, the same shade as Anna's, lay limp against the thin hospital pillow. When Anna entered, the woman's eyes opened. They held the same quality as her daughter's, dark, expressive, capable of conveying complex emotions without words. But where Anna's eyes showed hope, her mother's revealed something closer to resignation. She had been here before, Alessandro understood. She had been fighting this fight alone, with insufficient resources, watching the inevitable approach while trying to shield her daughter from the reality they faced. Anna climbed onto the bed, with the practiced ease of countless similar visits, nestling against her mother's side. The woman's arm encircled her daughter, holding her with a protectiveness that transcended her physical weakness. Only then did she truly register Alessandro's presence. This man, in an expensive suit standing in her hospital room, rain-soaked and impossibly out of place, radiating a kind of danger that even the desperately ill could sense. Alessandro introduced himself using only his first name, omitting the surname that would have meant everything or nothing depending on what she knew. He explained that Anna had asked for help finding her father. The woman, her name was Maria, closed her eyes briefly, a gesture that conveyed volumes. When she opened them again, tears had formed, though she blinked them back with fierce determination. What Maria told him, over the next 20 minutes, speaking in a low voice while Anna dozed against her shoulder, painted a picture Alessandro knew all too well from the perspective he usually occupied, that of the one in control rather than the collateral damage. Anna's father, Michael Rodriguez, had worked as a driver for a distribution operation in Brooklyn. He had been dependable, quiet, good with routes and schedules. Then 3 years ago, he vanished. No body, no explanation, no final paycheck. Just gone, as if he had never existed. Maria had searched at first. She had called numbers that went unanswered, visited addresses that turned out to be abandoned buildings or businesses that claimed never to have heard of him. The message became clear. Stop looking, stop asking, forget and move on. So she had, because she had Anna to think about and because she understood that some questions once asked too persistently, turned the asker into another disappearance statistic. They had moved to Newark for a fresh start, but fresh starts require money they did not have. Maria worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night, serving tables during lunch shifts, but it was never quite enough. When the symptoms started 6 months ago, she ignored them as long as possible. The cough, the fatigue, the weight loss. By the time she finally went to a free clinic, the lung infection had progressed to a point requiring hospitalization. The antibiotics were expensive, the care ongoing, the medical bills accumulating with terrifying speed. Anna had been staying with a neighbor, an elderly woman who meant well but could barely care for herself. Tonight, the neighbor had fallen asleep early, and Anna had slipped out, driven by a child's logic that if she could find someone who knew her father's world, maybe that person could bring him back and fix everything that had broken in their lives. Alessandro listened without interrupting, his face carefully neutral, betraying none of the thoughts churning behind his controlled exterior. He knew how Michael Rodriguez's story had ended, even without specific details. Men like Michael, reliable but unremarkable, cogs in larger machines, vanished for simple reasons. A moment of poor judgment, a wrong word to the wrong person, being in the wrong place when examples needed to be made. The machinery of organized crime required periodic sacrifices, not for any strategic purpose, but to maintain fear. To remind everyone that loyalty was not optional and that disappearance was always just one mistake away. Alessandro excused himself and stepped into the hallway, pulling out his phone. The first call went to his attorney, a man who specialized in making problems disappear through legal rather than violent means. The conversation was brief. Take care of the medical bills for room 317, all of them, past and future. Set up an account that would cover expenses for however long necessary. Use a shell company. Make it anonymous. Ensure no trail led back. The second call went to Sal, his most trusted lieutenant. Alessandro gave specific instructions. Locate any records regarding Michael Rodriguez, find out what happened and why, determine if any of his people had been involved. Do it quietly, without stirring old business, but do it completely. Sal's silence on the other end spoke volumes. They both understood what this meant. The boss was going soft, involving himself in something that should remain buried. But Sal, to his credit, simply acknowledged the order and promised results within 48 hours. The third call went to a contact in social services, a caseworker Alessandro had helped years ago when the woman's gambling-addicted brother had gotten in deep with the wrong lenders. The debt had been forgiven in exchange for future favors, never quite specified. Tonight, Alessandro collected, explaining that a child needed emergency placement with proper supervision while her mother recovered, that the current arrangement was inadequate, that this needed to happen immediately and correctly. The caseworker, hearing something in Alessandro's tone that suggested refusal was not an option, agreed to expedite matters. When Alessandro returned to the room, Anna had fallen fully asleep, her small body curled against her mother's side, her broken umbrella still clutched in one hand. Maria watched him with eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize what he was even without knowing his name. She was not stupid, this woman. She understood that help from men like Alessandro came with prices, though she could not fathom what price he might extract from someone who had nothing to give. Alessandro sat in the room's single plastic chair and spoke quietly, explaining what he had arranged. The medical bills would be covered. A proper social worker would ensure Anna's care during Maria's recovery. There would be no cost, no debt, no obligation. Maria's expression cycled through disbelief, suspicion, desperate hope, and finally something like understanding. She asked the only question that mattered: why? Alessandro looked at the sleeping child, at her rain-soaked pink coat and broken umbrella, at her small hand, still clutching her mother's hospital gown. He thought about all the decisions he had made, all the orders he had given, all the consequences he had never allowed himself to fully consider, because consideration would have made the business impossible. He thought about fathers who had disappeared and children who waited for returns that would never come. He thought about the insulation he had built around himself, the careful distance he maintained from the human cost of his empire's operation. When he finally answered, his voice carried a weariness that had been accumulating for decades. He told Maria that her daughter had asked for help, and that sometimes, very rarely, even men like him remembered what it meant to be asked for help by someone who believed you might give it. It was not a good answer, not complete or entirely truthful, but it was the only answer he had. Alessandro left the hospital as the rain finally stopped, the storm having exhausted itself against the city's indifferent infrastructure. The streets glistened under street lamps, reflecting orange light in patterns that looked almost beautiful if you ignored everything they illuminated. He walked back to where his car waited, his suit still damp, his mind occupied with thoughts he had successfully avoided for most of his adult life. The compound Alessandro called home occupied a gated property in Alpine, New Jersey, where old money and new money coexisted in an uneasy détente, each pretending not to notice the sources of the other's wealth. The house itself was a modernist construction of glass and steel, designed by an architect who had won awards for creating spaces that blurred the boundary between interior and exterior. Alessandro had bought it because it demonstrated success, because its security systems were state-of-the-art, and because its isolated location made surveillance and unwanted visitors immediately obvious. He returned there in the early hours of morning as dawn began its slow transformation of the sky from black to deep blue. His men had already returned, having smoothed things with the Colombians by offering concessions that would cost Alessandro money, but preserve the relationship. They knew better than to ask questions about where their boss had gone or why he had abandoned a crucial negotiation to help a lost child. In their world, such anomalous behavior was either a strategy too complex to understand or a personal matter too dangerous to probe. Alessandro went to his office, a room of dark wood and leather that had been decorated to project authority and intimidation, and poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey from a decanter older than most of his employees. He did not drink it immediately. Instead, he stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked his property, watching the sunrise paint the manicured lawn and the distant trees, thinking about a 6-year-old girl who had seen him and decided he looked like someone who might help. The phone call from Sal came at 9 a.m., precisely 43 hours ahead of the original deadline. Alessandro listened without interrupting as Sal detailed what he had discovered about Michael Rodriguez. The story was depressingly predictable. Michael had been driving for a Brooklyn crew that handled pharmaceutical distribution, the kind of operation that existed in the shadow spaces between street-level dealers and pharmaceutical executives who would never acknowledge how much of their product disappeared into illegal channels. Michael had been reliable for 3 years, then made the fatal mistake of trying to help his sister, who had been suffering through cancer treatment without insurance. He had skimmed, not much, just enough to cover a few medication costs, thinking that in the vast river of pills and money flowing through the operation, such a small amount would never be noticed or missed. But everything gets noticed eventually. Examples must be made. Bodies must occasionally materialize to remind everyone else of consequences. Except Michael's body had never been found, which was unusual but not unprecedented. What was more interesting and troubling was who had given the order. The Brooklyn crew reported to a capo named Vincent Delacroix, who in turn paid tribute to the Lucchese family. But Vincent had been tight with a rival of Alessandro's, a man named Gino Marchetti, who'd been making territorial pushes into Alessandro's operations for the past 5 years. The hit on Michael Rodriguez had been part of a larger message. This is our territory. These are our people. We handle our business without consulting you. Alessandro set down his whiskey glass with controlled precision, the crystal making a definitive sound against the wood. The larger picture was becoming clear. Michael Rodriguez had been sacrificed not merely for skimming pills, but as a territorial marker, a way of saying that certain operations in Brooklyn would proceed without deference to Alessandro's organization. It was the kind of disrespect that required response in their world, the kind of challenge that, if left unanswered, invited further encroachment. But Alessandro had let it slide at the time, 3 years ago. He had been occupied with a federal investigation that was threatening his construction business, fighting a legal battle that required his full attention. He had calculated that small territorial losses in Brooklyn were acceptable if they allowed him to focus on protecting his more valuable assets in Manhattan and New Jersey. He had made a strategic decision, coldly rational, without considering that strategy always had human costs. Now those costs had a face. They had tangled dark hair and hopeful eyes. They clutched a broken umbrella and asked strangers for help finding a daddy who was buried in a construction foundation somewhere, his disappearance never to be solved. His family left to struggle and wonder and slowly drown in poverty and illness. Alessandro made a series of calls over the following days, reaching out to sources throughout his network. He learned that Vincent Delacroix had risen in status since the Rodriguez hit, gaining control of additional distribution channels, expanding into territory that had once been neutral ground. Gino Marchetti's organization had grown bolder, testing boundaries, looking for weaknesses to exploit. The entire ecosystem had shifted in small ways that accumulated over 3 years, represented a significant erosion of Alessandro's influence. On the 4th day, Alessandro drove to Brooklyn, to a warehouse district where Vincent Delacroix conducted business, from an office that still smelled of the machinery that had occupied the space before gentrification and real estate speculation had transformed the neighborhood's economic landscape. He went without his usual security detail, just his driver and one guard, a gesture that communicated confidence rather than vulnerability. Vincent was younger than Alessandro, maybe 40, with the particular handsomeness that came from expensive dental work and regular gym sessions. He dressed like someone who had watched too many gangster movies, favoring designer tracksuits and gold chains that announced wealth without class. He received Alessandro with performative respect, offering espresso and pastries, pretending that this visit was social rather than what they both knew it was, a reckoning. Alessandro declined the refreshments and came directly to the point. 3 years ago, Vincent had ordered the death of a man named Michael Rodriguez. This had been done without clearance, in territory where such actions required consultation out of respect for established relationships. Alessandro wanted to know why the courtesy had not been extended. Vincent's expression shifted through several micro-emotions: surprise at the specific name, concern about where this was leading, calculation about how to respond. He offered the expected justifications. Rodriguez had been stealing, examples needed to be made. It was internal business that did not require external permission. Alessandro listened without reaction, then asked a different question. Had Vincent considered what happened to Rodriguez's family afterward? Had he thought about the wife and child left behind? The cascade of consequences that followed a man's disappearance? The question clearly confused Vincent. In their world, such considerations were weaknesses. You did not think about families. You did not track consequences beyond the immediate tactical level. You made decisions based on business logic. Theft equals punishment. Challenges require responses. Loyalty must be enforced through fear. The human elements were irrelevant complications that clouded judgment and invited emotional mistakes. Alessandro stood, the movement deliberate and controlled. He told Vincent that the Rodriguez matter would be settled, that compensation would be provided to the family, and that Vincent's organization would be contributing to that compensation. It was not a request. The amount Alessandro named was significant, enough to cause financial pain, but not enough to justify war. Vincent's face cycled through anger and calculation before settling on reluctant acceptance. He understood the game being played. Alessandro was reasserting authority, drawing boundaries, reminding everyone that certain courtesies still mattered. As Alessandro prepared to leave, Vincent asked the question both men had been circling around. Why did this matter now, 3 years later? For some dead driver nobody remembered? Alessandro paused at the door, his hand on the frame, his back to Vincent. When he spoke, his voice carried something Vincent had never heard before, something that almost sounded like regret. He said that sometimes you meet someone who reminds you that the people in your world are not abstractions, that consequences are not theoretical, that every decision creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate calculation. St. Anthony's Church occupied a corner in Newark's ironbound district, its stone facade blackened by decades of industrial pollution, its stained glass windows protected by security grating that testified to the neighborhood's complicated relationship with faith and property. Alessandro had not entered this building in 20 years, not since his mother's funeral, not since the last time he had engaged in the rituals of a belief system he had long since abandoned as incompatible with the life he had chosen. The interior was dim, illuminated only by votive candles flickering in red glass containers and the afternoon light filtering through stained glass, depicting scenes from the lives of saints, men and women who had supposedly found redemption through suffering and sacrifice. The smell was exactly as Alessandro remembered, incense and candle wax and stone and something else, something that might have been holiness if you believed such things existed outside human imagination. Father Thomas was older now, his hair fully white, his back slightly bent, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him effective in a parish where poverty and crime created endless pastoral challenges. He recognized Alessandro immediately, though surprise registered on his face. In 20 years, Alessandro had contributed generously to the church, anonymous donations that kept the building maintained and the food bank stocked, but he had never returned in person, never sought spiritual counsel or participated in Mass. The confessional booth was cramped and dark, designed for whispered admissions of minor sins, lustful thoughts, petty lies, failures of charity. Alessandro's knees protested as he settled onto the worn wooden kneeler, his frame too large for a space designed for average-sized penitents. Through the screen, he could see Father Thomas's profile, the priest's head bowed in the traditional posture of listening without judgment, the traditional words caught in Alessandro's throat. He had not said them in so long that they felt foreign, like a language half forgotten. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 20 years since my last confession." The understatement would have been comical if the situation had contained any element of humor. Father Thomas made a small sound, not quite encouragement, not quite absolution, just acknowledgement that he was listening, that the ancient ritual was proceeding according to forms established centuries before either of them had been born. Alessandro began to speak, and once started, found himself unable to stop. The words came like water breaching a compromised dam, the pressure too great to contain any longer. He did not confess specific crimes. Father Thomas did not need to hear the detailed accounting of violence ordered and executed, of lives ended on Alessandro's word, of families destroyed by decisions made in pursuit of profit and power. Such specifics would accomplish nothing except transferring knowledge that would burden the priest with information he could neither act upon nor forget. Instead, Alessandro spoke of the larger pattern, the way he had insulated himself from consequences, the deliberate distance he had maintained between action and result, the careful self-deception that had allowed him to function in a world that required brutality while maintaining some vestige of self-respect. He told Father Thomas about Anna, about a small girl in a rain-soaked pink coat asking a monster for help finding her daddy. He described the moment of recognition, seeing himself reflected in a child's hopeful eyes, and understanding that he had become exactly the kind of man responsible for creating children like her, orphans in all but name, collateral damage from conflicts they could not understand or escape. Alessandro's voice, normally so controlled, cracked as he spoke about visiting Michael Rodriguez's family, about realizing that behind every decision he had made, every order he had given, there existed actual human beings whose suffering was not theoretical but immediate and ongoing. He had known this intellectually, of course. He was not stupid or completely without conscience. But knowledge and understanding were different things. Knowing that actions had consequences was different from meeting those consequences face to face, from having them ask you for help in a voice small with hope and fear. Father Thomas listened without interrupting, occasionally shifting in his seat, but otherwise still. When Alessandro finally fell silent, exhausted by confession, the priest was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades spent hearing admissions of human failure in all its varieties. The priest did not offer easy absolution. He acknowledged that Alessandro's sins were grave, that the suffering he had caused could not be undone by a single act of kindness or a moment of recognition. But he also spoke of the Christian concept of metanoia, not mere remorse, but fundamental transformation, a turning away from old patterns towards something different. He suggested that Alessandro's crisis was not simply guilt, but a confrontation with the reality he had been avoiding, that his life had been built on a foundation of causing harm, and that no amount of money or power could ultimately reconcile that with any meaningful conception of human dignity or purpose. The penance Father Thomas assigned was not traditional prayers or devotional acts. Instead, he directed Alessandro to consider what genuine change would look like, not symbolic gestures, but structural transformation. If Alessandro truly wanted something other than the life he had been living, that would require not just helping one family, but stepping away from the systems that created such families, that turned ordinary people into disposable resources in conflicts they did not choose. Alessandro left the confessional booth without absolution, because Father Thomas was honest enough not to offer what he could not truly give. The transformation the priest described would take more than an afternoon in a dark booth whispering admissions. It would require years, decades perhaps, of different choices, of actively dismantling what he had built, of facing consequences he had carefully avoided. It might not even be possible. Men in Alessandro's position did not simply walk away. The business did not allow retirement unless it was terminal, either through death or incarceration. But as Alessandro emerged from the church into the Newark afternoon, something had shifted. He felt lighter in a way he had not experienced since before he had made the first compromising decision that had set him on this path. The world looked the same trash-littered streets, the same struggling storefronts, the same human struggle against entropy and poverty. But Alessandro saw it differently now. He saw it not as background scenery to his empire, but as the actual world, populated by actual people whose lives were shaped by decisions made by men like him. That evening, Alessandro returned to St. Michael's Medical Center. Maria had improved, the antibiotics finally conquering the infection that had threatened her life. Anna was there, chattering about her day at a temporary foster home that had been carefully selected to be kind and competent. When she saw Alessandro, her face lit up with recognition and something that might have been affection. She ran to him and hugged his leg, this small gesture of trust from someone who should have known better than to trust men who looked like him. Alessandro gave Maria an envelope containing information about a trust fund that would ensure Anna's education and their basic needs for years to come. The money came from multiple sources, part from Vincent Delacroix's enforced contribution, part from Alessandro's own accounts, all of it cleaned through channels that would never reveal its origins. Maria took it with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face, trying to thank him in words that came nowhere close to expressing what she felt. Alessandro knelt down to Anna's level one more time. He told her that her daddy could not come home, that sometimes people went away and could not return no matter how much we wanted them to, but he also told her that she and her mother would be okay, that they would have what they needed, that she should study hard and be kind, and remember that even in a difficult world there were people who would help if you were brave enough to ask. Anna nodded solemnly, processing information that was simultaneously honest and incomplete. Then she asked Alessandro if he would visit again. The question caught him off guard, and for a moment he could not respond. Finally, he promised that he would check on them, that they would not be forgotten, that someone would make sure they were safe. As Alessandro walked out of the hospital for the last time, he made a phone call to his attorney. The conversation was brief but significant. He wanted a meeting arranged with federal prosecutors, the ones who had been investigating his organization for years, gathering evidence but never quite accumulating enough for an indictment. Alessandro was ready to discuss terms, cooperation in exchange for certain protections, information in exchange for reduced consequences, truth in exchange for whatever mercy the system might offer. It would be a long process, Alessandro knew. Years of testimony, of revealing secrets, of watching the empire he had built be dismantled piece by piece. Some of his associates would face prison, others would redirect their operations, finding new patrons or new territories. The underworld would adjust because it always adjusted, filling vacuums and adapting to changed circumstances with the fluid efficiency of water finding new channels. But Alessandro would no longer be part of it. He would become something different, not redeemed, because some debts could never be fully paid, but changed. He would become a man who, when asked for help by a small girl in a rain-soaked pink coat, had looked at his reflection in her hopeful eyes and decided that who he had been was no longer who he would continue to be. The rain started again as Alessandro drove home, gentle this time, washing the city streets clean in the way that rain always promised but never quite delivered. Tomorrow he would begin the process of transformation, the meetings with prosecutors, the protection of those few associates who had remained loyal and decent despite their circumstances, the careful navigation of a transition that would satisfy both legal requirements and his own need to minimize additional harm. But tonight, Alessandro allowed himself a moment of something that might have been peace. A small girl named Anna would grow up with opportunities her father's death had nearly stolen from her. Her mother would recover and build a life beyond survival. They would remember a stranger who had helped them in their darkest moment, never knowing the full complexity of who he had been or what their request had cost him. It was not redemption. It was not even close to sufficient recompense for decades of causing harm. But it was a beginning, a first step away from the man Alessandro Costa had been towards someone he might, with years of difficult work, eventually become. If you found this story moving and want to experience more compelling narratives that explore the complexity of human nature, redemption, and unexpected connections, please subscribe to our channel. Every week, we bring you stories that will make you think, feel, and see the world from new perspectives. Don't miss our next journey into the depths of the human heart. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of storytellers and story lovers.